for International Media Assistance. I'd like to welcome everyone to our event, Local News in Times of Crisis. My name is Heather Gilberts, and I am CIMA's Associate Director and Editor. For those of you who are unfamiliar with our work, the Center for International Media Assistance is a research and knowledge platform within the National Endowment for Democracy. We are dedicated to improving efforts to support independent media around the world. We advance this mission by producing high-quality research, convening working groups among stakeholders in the media development community, and hosting events such as this. The topic of today's event, Local News During Crisis, is particularly timely. The COVID-19 pandemic has revealed the critical role of local news as trusted sources of information in communities around the world. However, local media were in peril even before the current crisis, and in the wake of COVID-19, numerous outlets globally are poised to collapse. These issues and others will be explored by our panelists. The webinar will follow a roundtable format. Each panelist will respond to a series of questions related to the role local news outlets play during a crisis, the challenges they face, and how international assistance organizations can support them. After the roundtable is complete, we will have 20 minutes for comments and questions from the audience. You can use the Zoom Q&A chat function to type a comment or question to the webinar's hosts at any time during the presentations, but all questions and comments will be held until the roundtable is complete. So without further delay, I'd like to introduce the event's moderator, Sam Chanthavong. Sam is the Associate Director of Global Programs at the National Endowment for Democracy, and she will provide a few introductory remarks, introduce our panelists, and kick off the roundtable. On behalf of CIMA, thank you for joining this event, and over to you, Sam.
Thank you, Heather, and thanks to everyone in the audience for joining us today. By way of introduction, perhaps I'll start by talking just a bit about the National Endowment for Democracy's media support. As a grant-making institution, we've long prioritized support for independent media across the world. It's very much a demand-driven approach. Media groups are the ones that identify what challenges they want to address and what the pressing needs are in their specific contexts. Our support kind of runs the gamut from grants that focus on capacity building in different areas to media freedom advocacy to providing legal assistance in closing spaces. A significant portion of our media support is for what we call the core operating costs of the news groups, because for us, media just existing as independent voices, undertaking their regular job of reporting the news and informing citizens, regardless of the specific topics they're covering, is what's important to us. So the approach is very much of the school of recognizing and supporting the intrinsic value of media in democracy building. And part of this commitment is our support for journalism, not only at the national level, but at the subnational level. So in this context, we're talking about local news outlets that have a public interest orientation and that are covering particular regions, towns, villages, and are trying to reach particular communities. And the rationale behind the support is our belief that local media groups play a key role in fostering a sense of community, in providing diverse coverage, in cultivating civic and political participation. But most of us at this event today are journalists and media development practitioners and democracy advocates, so I don't really need to go on and on about the value of independent media to you all. But speaking of this kind of collective us in the global community, you know, we've been talking about the challenges that have characterized the media landscape for years and years now. And also for what seems like quite some time now, at least to me, people have been sounding the alarm bells about the particular challenges to local journalism and how local news all over the world is in danger of dying. So the topic today isn't new per se, but perhaps it's become an even more urgent topic of conversation at a time when all of the challenges that characterize the media environment have been exacerbated. As Heather had mentioned, with the pandemic, with the various conflicts and various crises just amplifying existing problems even more, we thought that it would be kind of worthwhile to really look at these issues again to underline the sense of urgency in trying to figure out what can be done, and to see if we can, at the very least, start advancing the conversation a bit further on this front. And to help us reflect on these issues today, we have three guests who will lead the conversation about how they see the state of local news. Lakshmi Parthasarathi is the Chief Operating Officer of Global Press, an international news organization that trains and employs local female reporters in undercovered media markets. She leads the organization's worldwide operations and spearheads its global expansion strategy to build new news bureaus. Most recently, she launched news bureaus in Mongolia, Mexico, Nepal, and Puerto Rico. And James Smart is an experienced journalist, primetime television anchor, talk show host based in Nairobi, Kenya. He's worked with the BBC to produce its Focus on Africa broadcast, which is a flagship TV news program that highlights stories from across the African continent. James has also worked extensively with Kenya's leading TV stations, and as part of his media work, he's been focused on public opinion in government and politics, youth inclusion and participatory governance, and minorities representation in media. He currently trains community journalists from Eastland's Nairobi to set up media platforms and engagement forums. And last but not least, Teresa Gorman is the Senior Program Associate for Local News in the Public Square program at Democracy Fund, which is an independent foundation working to strengthen American democracy. The Public Square program in particular works to ensure people have access to the news and information they need to engage in civic life, and Teresa runs the program's local ecosystem news funding portfolio, providing support to local news ecosystems in US states like North Carolina, New Jersey, New Mexico, and Colorado. So we'll have 30 minutes to have the conversation, and then we'll, as Heather mentioned, open it up for Q&A. Maybe to start off, to our three guests, each of you is coming at this topic from different vantage points, right? So James, you're focused on Kenya, but you also have experience in the Africa region more broadly. Teresa, you've looked at the US media landscape. And Lakshmi, you have kind of the comparative experience working with local journalists in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. So before we kind of jump into the meat of the discussion about local journalism's challenges, I wonder if you can help us reflect on kind of the indispensable role that local journalism plays, why it's needed, and how, you know, COVID-19 as the latest crisis is putting into stark relief that importance even more. Maybe we can start with James.
Thank you for having me. I think the role of journalism as a whole is indispensable. We play a role that is literally in the middle of the community and the government and the people who govern it. And for most part, journalism, we're aware what journalism does. We're aware what journalists do. We journalists, you know, go into different areas. They're difficult areas to report on. We expect journalists to go there and bring us the information and bring us the story. We trust journalists with this function. It's a public function. So that we are able to make emotional connection with what happens in areas that we cannot reach, with people that perhaps, you know, we need to know about and things we need to know about. And for us this time, I think that what COVID-19 has helped us to do in terms of local journalism, it has helped us to focus what journalism is for. That we finally had to get content to people that is timely, and it's a matter of life and death. You know, that we had to go to areas where you say, look, this information is useful, but if people need it now. People needed to understand the issues of face masks, for instance. People need to understand the issue of social distance. People need to understand it was a health crisis, but had, you know, other sort of economic and social issues tied to it. One of the things that was important for us earlier on, and we noticed, was that the fact that COVID-19 had happened, local journalists in our spaces were able to magnify the issues that the communities were dealing with for the long time. Issues, you know, such as economic issues, health issues, the issues of the gender stereotypes and that sort of thing. These issues have been living inside of our communities for a long time. However, during COVID-19, these issues became so stark and they became so apparent. And the only way they could come out, it was in this time. And COVID-19 sort of helped us to highlight this issue. and there was a public that was ready to listen, because it wasn't just another information anymore. It was something that can be useful and can be used today.
Great. Teresa, maybe from your vantage point.
Sure. And thanks for having me, and hello, everybody. So like Sam said, we have been talking about the importance of local news to our democracy for a long time, but it seems like finally people are listening, and we know that when newsrooms close, when journalists disappear, fewer people vote, run for office, government corruption goes up, our neighborhoods grow more polarized. So we know this from knowing, doing research on when outlets do close. So we don't want that to happen. And no matter what efforts you work on, local news is core to making sure that they succeed. We also know that COVID-19 has laid bare the inequities that, in the US we face. And it's been really, really clear, thanks to much of the effort of local news. After the murder of George Floyd and many others, we have been able to rely on some local news to tell those stories and to make change in our communities.
Great. And Lakshmi, anything to add?
Absolutely. Thanks, Sam, and thanks, CIMA, for hosting this panel. It's such an important moment right now, as you've mentioned, to recognize that local journalism is the future of international reporting. This is what we've been saying at Global Press for many years. We've always valued the local, unique access that our local reporters provide, the nuanced analysis, the level of diversity and representation that they bring to their stories is just unmatched elsewhere. But people are paying attention to that now. So what we're seeing is that global newsrooms for a very long time have not really respected local reporters. They're often treated as fixers or researchers, but in this moment, it's critical that we recognize that local reporters deserve to be the reporter, get the byline. And we often see, global newsrooms helicopter into places to cover war, poverty, disaster, disease. And at Global Press, our reporters have been there well before a crisis has happened to report on long-term consequences, to look at local communities dealing and grappling with these consequences of events. If you're interested in tracking what's been going on with post-earthquake efforts in Nepal since 2015, you can find that on Global Press Journal, because our local reporters have been there for many years covering that and tracking a government response. If you want to understand, a decades-long economic crisis in Zimbabwe and the consequences of that on expecting mothers in Harare or Bulawayo or Mutare, you can read that on Global Press Journal because local reporters are covering it. We see this time and time again, that nuanced analysis and unique access that reporters locally based can provide is critically important, especially in moments like this when local journalism is globally relevant. James had mentioned this, it's a matter of life or death in some places, and we're actually able to cover places when foreign correspondents are frankly grounded in this moment. It's a great example of when a local approach to information gathering and information sharing is of the utmost importance, when we can't rely on national reports and national responses, because how Kisangani DRC is dealing with COVID-19 is very different than how Utari province is dealing with it in DRC, where there's a more imminent threat of armed groups. So it's really important that we hyper localize these stories.
And I think for even just beyond COVID-19, in a lot of places where the NED has kind of local partners, there are countries with, active conflicts going on. And what we've found is that the local news organizations in those conflict areas are able to kind of even set the agenda in terms of how that conflict is being set, so that national news agencies are turning to and relying on those local news groups to be able to provide kind of like alternative perspectives, and not just relying on kind of the government's explanation or recounting of events. Teresa, can you talk a little bit about, you mentioned in terms of the impact of the loss of local journalism on kind of civic life, and also the role that it can play in lessening polarization. And so particularly in the context of the United States, what's the connection between less polarization when there's local journalism?
Great question. Yeah, so we know that when, for example, a newspaper in Colorado closed, they did a study that showed after fewer people volunteered, fewer people participated in different community groups. And it's really important for local news to show stories, to get people together, and to do that even more. I think that, like James said, many local news outlets are now changing how they do their work to bring people together in more ways. So not doing the traditional, here's a story, hope you find it in the paper, but instead in Detroit, they're sending texts, or in New Jersey, outlet is making maps of where people can find food. And so people are relying on these local news outlets and then trusting them to bring them together. So we're really seeing that. But we also are seeing on the flip side, many outlets don't have that knowledge or that understanding of how to do that. So it's really important in this moment to help them understand how to do some of that work.
And James, can you just talk a little bit, particularly because you've been working with, I believe, youth, right, and community journalists, and kind of in terms of the value of local journalism to help citizens kind of see themselves in the news, and to be able to amplify the concerns and allow members of the communities themselves to tell their stories, maybe based off of your experience with K Media and working with young people. You can talk a little bit about that aspect of local journalism.
I think one of the most important things that basically just gives the difference between sort of national news and international journalism with local journalism, the first thing I think is the content. The content that what the local journalists that we work with and what they wanted to highlight, for instance, has to be a lot of the content we produce, that it has to be very useful. It has to be very useful to the community that we serve today. That is very important. I'll give an example. One of the biggest stories that before COVID-19 and will run after COVID-19 is the question of crime and how society actually views crime. We have people who either get arrested, people who either get killed by police, and that sort of thing. And the way we view this from a national politics and national sort of discourse is these are criminals and they're supposed to be in jail. There's usually less empathy, towards these people, and many of them are young people. People who get killed, we have a lot of that in this country. There's less, the public, because of how it's been covered, the public feels less and less empathy towards families and, sort of young people who get killed by police. However, in our content and what you see with these young people, what they try to bring to the story more often is that this majority of these young people aren't just evil, they are victims of circumstances. There's inequality, there's mental health problems, and they try to bring this in the stories because they humanize the point of view from where they come from, because stories and journalism is not just another piece for them. This is important because they live in these communities and they're trying to fix a problem. So the journalism that they try to produce is very useful because it's something that it can be used now. One of the things that we found that when we tell these stories is that the community is trusting these kind of stories a bit more because it is useful. It is not just another beautiful story. It's not just another exclusive that can win awards. It's good to win awards and that sort of thing. But the community today needs sort of content that they can make useful. So the content and context, those are two different things and two important things, I would say, currently, that we're seeing that community journalism is sort of setting apart with what would find elsewhere. That just not another story that's about people that we don't know what to do with it. Because sometimes it's one of the criticism of journalism. Some stories you read and you don't know what to do with it. It is brilliant, it's amazing, but it just leaves you with, oh my, what am I supposed to do with all this? Because you don't have agency, human agency in it. And what this local journalism is trying to do is bring the human agency into it, that we can do something about this in our space. It's like we talked about, how, we hyper, make the local journalism to be hyper. So that's the fact, and that's the point, that we must be able to help these communities tell their own stories to themselves, because with that we start fixing the inequality problem, we start fixing governance problems, we start giving human agency to people to start fixing the problems that we face in different sort of jurisdictions.
Great, thank you, James. Most recently, as the COVID-19, as you've shared with us, has kind of highlighted the ways that local journalism is, needed and more vital more than ever. It's also kind of heightened all of the challenges that local journalism had already been facing. And so I wonder if each of you can kind of outline some of the main challenges that local media outlets are currently facing that are exacerbated by crisis and conflict. And maybe this time we can start with Teresa.
Sure. Well, I think I've shared with many people that if you want to get a depressing statistic, come to me. I can share it, but also with some hope attached. So the economic trend that we thought would happen over the next 5 years is happening over the next 5 months. We have seen in the US, as of April, 36,000 jobs were lost in the journalism industry, and many thousands more since. Even over the last 15 years, over 2,000 papers have closed. We saw that one study said that 50% of the hotspot areas where COVID-19 was worse were news deserts. So we see this correlation happening even worse. So the economic reality, outlets' revenue is falling, community media have lost 75 to 100% of advertising revenue. We know that funding will probably fall in the next year from philanthropy. So there's great worries there, but there's also worries around safety. Many of the resources that kind of more traditional news organizations used to have for people no longer exist. So mental health resources, a mask. We have had to raise money just to get journalists masks to be safe outside. We know that people are being harassed. We know that over 500 journalists have been attacked by police at protests across the country over the past few weeks. So again and again, we're seeing this huge impact that's just been escalated over the past few months.
Lakshmi?
Sure. And thank you for making those points, Teresa. I think it's such a, we've been talking about local news deserts for years. I've been reading reports on, local news deserts in Canada and in the US and across North America. But when you're, looking at it from this global perspective, that our global lens that global press has, what we're recognizing is there are, two really major challenges I'd like to talk about. One is that in any given country, many local communities are underrepresented by independent media. So, this is obviously due to many different challenges. But in a country, for example, like Mongolia, you'll see there's over 400 news organizations registered in one country. Most of those are based in Ulaanbaatar city. So you're seeing a lack of representation from Gobi Desert, from Arkhangai province, from the rest of the country. So then you get the narrative of eagle herders and pollution, and there's just two stories being shared. So that challenge of making sure local newsrooms are able to stay independent, and that means there's some serious political and industry alliances within some of these local newsrooms because they're reliant on them. Reporters aren't paid living wages, which makes it very difficult to conduct independent journalism in local communities. So at Global Press, we've intentionally set out to launch new news bureaus in places with few to no journalism jobs to provide high quality access to training and high quality access to employment. Sometimes that means advanced technology and tools that make collaboration and reporting more feasible in remote locations. While conducting research to figure out where Global Press should launch next, it's become very clear to us that there is demand for high quality journalism jobs. Just in Mongolia alone, we received 700 applications for only 7 local reporter positions. Those local reporters aren't all based in Ulaanbaatar, they're in, the provinces. So, this idea of just staying independent requires many operational support mechanisms, funding, and this kind of oversimplified narrative is then corrected when we're addressing many different local communities in one national context.
James, would you like to add anything?
I think the last point for me is I think that many local journalists work as volunteers, and that introduces a problem where people who are at the middle of helping communities to transact and find correct information and information that is helpful, they are unable to feed themselves, and this is a massive problem. In many of sub-Saharan Africa, and many newsrooms and many platforms that are able to survive or are going to be wiped out. The second most important thing is that in many laws and many regimes we've seen, many local journalists would not be recognized by either the council, the media council of their own countries, which is unable to sort of give them certification or identification so that they can work in these communities with legitimacy that it's required. Those two problems combined make the work of local journalists to be not only thankless but almost impossible, because they get targeted by authorities when they report on issues that seems no one wanted to be reported, and in many cases, because you're unable to identify yourself as a journalist for a reason or the other, it becomes impossible for these people to have the confidence to challenge local systems, because that is the job of journalism today, and the hard work that we sort of have the local journalists do. So to add on those points, those two things are one of the things that in our sort of setup makes it difficult, and we have to negotiate every other day and consistently with authorities to allow reporters to move around, camera people to move around. Half of my job working with young people and young journalists is removing them from police cells, because they get arrested all the time, and you have to go there and work with the police. So it makes it difficult to report. It makes it difficult to do a legitimate work when it's impossible to have these people properly recognized by the authorities.
Right. I mean, oh, yes, go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to add, James brings up a really great point just about, physical security of reporters being able to do that work, not just, and we've talked about also mental well-being, as Teresa mentioned as well. If we are not taking seriously that concept, the idea of duty of care of local journalist safety and security, and the many different aspects of that work, that's one of the biggest challenges I think a local reporter has to address. Legal, physical, emotional, and digital security is the approach that Global Press has taken. And we've chosen to prioritize something that's actually really unique for some reason in the news industry, treating the reporter as a whole person. The safety and security of that whole person is much more important to us than getting that story. And sometimes it's a combination of making sure we can do that safely. Navigating crisis is something we're very used to at Global Press, but in this moment where coronavirus is everywhere, And, you know, we've always dealt with situations where evacuation isn't an option for local reporters. It's just been more heightened now to really be thinking about, in every moment and in every country, what are the, you know, local details that we need to focus on? What are the, you know, the approach that we need to take to mental well-being for our staff to care for them? And, you know, for example, in Zimbabwe, James mentioned press credentialing. And Zimbabwe is a great example of kind of this invisible censorship concept, or the idea of, you know, taking advantage of this COVID-19 moment and using it as an opportunity to clamp down on the press. You know, local media has been under attack in many places around the world, but what we're seeing in Zimbabwe is reporters are considered essential services. They're allowed apparently to be out reporting as long as they carry their 2020 press passes. Now, the Zimbabwean government, the Media Commission, didn't actually issue 2020 press passes. And that was up until April of this year. It was only 2 weeks ago that they issued those 2020 press passes. So in that interim period, you're making a decision as to whether to take that risk and go out with your 2019 press pass and risk arrest, harassment from police officers. And these are the kinds of decisions that local reporters have to make every day. And if they're not supported by institutions and organizations that prioritize the well-being of the whole individual, it's bound to be a greater challenge for that local reporter.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's so important, the security aspects of it, because from our experience as well, I mean, reporters and activists in the province are particularly more vulnerable, I would say, because attacks on them are far away from the public eye, whether it's in that country nationally or even internationally, and so definitely an important area. And so, you know, you've outlined kind of these financial and economic and livelihood challenges, political challenges, the security challenges, something like the challenges presented by the pandemic itself. You know, maybe we can kind of just move on to sketch kind of what some of your ideas are for how to start addressing these challenges. And maybe I'd like to take maybe just a small slice of this time to kind of talk about, before we move on to what the international community can do to help, maybe to talk about what some of the local news innovations are, like the local news groups are doing to kind of adapt and confront this problem. Maybe Teresa, you can just talk a little bit about what you're seeing in the US context.
Sure. So I gave everyone a lot of depressing statistics, but there's also, I think, a moment right now that it's a moment of transformation, of possibility. So we are seeing many people and organizations on the ground that have been rallying to change how we do things, how we connect with communities, how we represent communities in our newsrooms, like was talked about, and are being listened to. So, for example, we're seeing organizations come together and collaborate and say, okay, let's share resources, let's figure out how we can help each other, let's put competition aside, let's think about ways we can build an entire ecosystem of local news and support. We're seeing organizations like Free Press, which helps advocate for changing how we connect with communities. And they are saying, okay, here's how to report differently about COVID and Black Lives Matter and other things like that. So they are being listened to and people are changing how they're doing their work. We are seeing organizations like City Bureau in the city of Chicago, which has said we need to say, what are the needs, like James said, that communities have and how can we serve them? And it doesn't have to be that beautiful story. And they have been asked to replicate that in 5 other cities. So we see this as an opportunity, but now funders and others have to step up to support that. There's a quote that I have on my desk that says, "Fund us like you want us to win." So we need to support all of this transformation and do it now.
Lakshmi or James, do you have anything to add about kind of some promising practices by the local reporters or the local media groups themselves?
Yeah, I would just add, on the same path of local journalist safety and security, we've talked about, in moments of crisis, how important mental well-being is and the wellness of reporters. So we've invested over the last few years in a wellness network of local language wellness counselors. So they're available free of charge for an unlimited number of sessions for reporters to access privately. And we've seen that 50% of our network has leveraged that in 2019 alone. So, that doesn't have to mean because of coronavirus. It could just be, source harassment. It can be, not being able to access the source that you need. There's so many things in the day-to-day of a local reporter where this becomes a priority. And the second is, whether it's in the US context or the global context, words matter. When we're talking about representation in journalism, representation of minority groups, words really matter. And at Global Press, we've developed the Global Press Style Guide. And this is essentially our way of covering people and places with dignity and precision. And that is highly informed by our local reporters who understand the communities they represent and are able to say, for example, developing world, what does that actually mean? Everywhere other than here in the United States or in Europe or where white people live? I'm not sure. So our call to action is constantly to be precise, to be dignified, and to really represent a true meaning behind what we're trying to describe, especially in times of crisis when these stories are framing narratives.
And James, maybe we can, just from where you're sitting, what should kind of donors and media support organizations consider kind of doing in terms of supporting local media during a time of crisis?
Thank you for that question. I think one of the things that is really important right now is, the entire media system is suffering from, the financial hurdles and financial struggles. We don't know advertisers are leaving the national media space. So even the national media themselves, they have less money and more problems to solve. I think that one of the key things that is could be helped is what Lakshmi, just sort of ended. One of the things is collaboration is very important. That if we can help local communities and local journalists to have sort of many forums and many stories working together with the national press, because the unique access that community journalists have and have a lot of reporting for years and years on end, by the time the national reporters, international journalists parachute into an area and make the story a big story, that there's this synergy there, and there's ways that we feel that we can have sort of forums and partnerships so that this reporting reaches international community, reaches national level, but at the same time is reporting that actually comes from the ground up. I think that is one. I think the second thing that actually is important is to make sure that this where these local reporters are working they're looked after as well-rounded professionals, and that's an important thing, because like has been said, and I want to repeat this point before, is that these journalists are usually the first to be attacked. They're usually the first to be fingered by the authorities, and when things happen to them, it is hardly national news, as opposed to a national journalist working on an important story, an investigative piece, getting arrested or getting harassed. So we have to figure out means and ways on how to leverage the quality of local journalists so that they become such an important piece of the public, an important piece of how the public communicates and how the civic discourse is negotiated. And in that sense, then we start giving them that leverage and that platform, and then they start giving the community what is required. I think one of the most important thing for international community finally is to continue helping in training This is the time to upskill. I think the people who are working in and doing a very important piece of work for the communities, because there's a question of tone, how we report things, and to who we report those things, and the question of that language. Just to pick up on Lakshmi's point, that language is important. And the point is, it's not just to tell different stories, it's to tell stories differently. And that is an important thing that you can only get by making sure that we get to the bottom, by making sure that the communities and the local journalists and the local newsrooms have important training to not only understand a story and do a story, but make sure that this story actually fits the community that they serve.
Lakshmi, do you have anything to add based off of your experiences in Asia and Latin America?
Yeah, when it comes to support from organizations or donor support, there's three really important questions that I would pose to all of these organizations and to donors specifically, and we've all said it over and over again. What are you doing to care for local reporters and not just the stories that they tell? Are you asking the organizations you support about the well-being of their reporters, whether they're implementing safety and security strategies? That's critical. Number two is take note of local constraints and priorities. In many parts of the world, coronavirus is not the only crisis taking place. Chronic crises such as seasonal diseases or shortages of basic supplies are just as imminent threats. And you need to take into account the full range of risks and priorities for each local community. This means also letting local reporters set their own storytelling priorities, not dictating what they should and should not cover, because they will know based on what they hear from their sources in their communities, what matters to that community. And then finally, it's provide unrestricted funding so that local orgs can be nimble, in just not in moments of crisis, but investing in operations and high quality employment models really allows local reporters to thrive in the settings that they're in, and for communities to access high quality information, particularly in places where we are the source of record.
Great, thanks, Lakshmi. Audience members, as Heather mentioned, there's a Q&A box in which you can kind of type and send your comments and questions that Heather will read out to the panelists. So please feel free to send them now if you haven't already. And maybe Heather, you can start reading out some of the comments or the questions to the panelists.
Can I add something about the funding?
Yes. Oh, yes, Teresa, go ahead.
Yeah, so I loved those points, and I just wanted to add, we've seen a slew of kind of COVID-related funding efforts, and have heard that, one, they're incredibly difficult to fill out. Everybody is spending so much time applying for this variety. So one, I would say, get out of the way, do the unrestricted funding, and collaborate with other funders or organizations providing support. We have done that through initiatives like Newsmatch, which has helped leverage a few million to over 50 million last year for nonprofit news in the US, and other ways. But we've really heard over the past few months, like, I appreciate your support, but I have 50 applications to fill out and 50 surveys being asked of me. So really think about ways that you can turn to the experts on this panel and other ways to learn and not redo everything.
That's very helpful, Teresa. Thank you. Heather?
Great, thanks, Sam, and thanks to all the panelists for this interesting discussion. First, I'd like to read a question from Carl Gershman, who is the National Endowment for Democracy's president. This question is very specific, aimed towards James. So it says, I wanted to ask James if he had seen my email yesterday about the Washington Post article about the killing of 2 young people in Nairobi, Kibera, with police complicity. Our fellow Ayu Jinu was speaking about the artist who highlights such injustices. He says, I assume local journalists would give visibility to such artists and musicians. Did you see that article, James? And do you have a response about this police killing of young people in places like Kibera and how local news is covering these issues?
Absolutely. Thank you, Carl, for your email. I was just about to respond this very long response because we deal all the time here with police killings. Every day we have the data and statistics. It's something like 4 or 5 people are killed in just one slum alone. So it's a very long response on your need. I think art is a very important tool in trying to deal with something as police killings in our context because it removes and it's able to, in a very raw way, explain what families are going through, what communities are going through. One of the most important things that we found out in our storytelling of police killings is that recently found out when we started talking to families who had buried sons who had been killed last year, was that none of the person who was killed by one bullet. They were killed by upwards of 4 to 10 to 14 sort of bullets. And you're wondering why was that the case? And the simple reason was that there's a policy in Kenya by the government of Kenya that the family will have to pay for each and every bullet that is pumped in a body. So that being the case, they make it expensive. They're killing poor people who cannot afford a meal. So putting 6, 7 bullets in a body makes it impossible for the family to claim the body. And in the end, they would have to say they will have to do what the police say. They would tell them, look, go and bury on such and such a day without noise, without calling lawyers, without civil society, without the media. And the families will take that because they're in grief and they don't know anything else to do. So I would say, yes, we have some art representations here. I've not seen the work in Nigeria. Would be very happy to see if there's sort of like a continental, angle to this because it's not very uniquely Kenyan. I can say for certain I've read a couple of stories about this in South Africa, in Uganda, in Tanzania, in Zambia. The story is all the same, and perhaps there is an opportunity there to use art and music to really help all of us to really understand what you're dealing with, to provide empathy for the families and young people, and use music and art to describe what's happening to all of us in terms of police violence that we also experience, and families that are in sort of slums in Nairobi and Kibera and Mathare. In Nairobi, for instance, start standing up and having words to explain what is happening to them, because it happens every day. The violence is awful. Sort of the public is sort of desensitized because we can no longer just say 4 young people were killed today. It's no longer news. The public expects it. The pictures are not shocking anymore.
Thanks, James. I think that shows kind of, we think about COVID-19 in terms of that being the current crisis, but there are many other crises that are always happening, and local news providers are very critical in raising awareness about those crises. So thanks for that, James. We have another sort of set of questions around the economic crisis that we've discussed quite a lot, the economic situation that local news outlets throughout the world are facing. We've talked a little bit about sort of some of the funding options. So Lakshmi, your point about direct core funding is needed to support local news outlets. One question also came from the audience in terms of how local news outlets need to adapt to this new reality. As we know, the economic crisis existed before COVID-19 and will persist afterwards. So how do local news outlets need to adapt? And have you seen examples of this in your networks? This is a question for all of the panelists.
I can share a few examples. So we've seen a rise over the past few years in exploring many varied revenue structures. So looking into membership, looking into individual donations, looking into philanthropy funding. We've also seen for example, in New York City, community media has come together to advocate for advertising together so that they have kind of a larger block, so that they are going to those national advertisers and others to say, we deserve your advertising and give it to us. And then specifically in the US, we have very little government funding for public interest media and journalism. So there have been many discussions about changing that structure, and now some of those things are happening because we know that one by one, local media can't really solve this revenue crisis. So we have to look at the structures behind it. So those are some of the things happening in the US.
Yeah, and I would add that this point of partnership when it comes to the local and global context is so critical, right? We are, as I mentioned in our conversation, that foreign correspondents are grounded currently, right? We're almost reliant, finally, on the local perspective and on local reporters. And so the opportunity really now is to partner with these local news organizations, to tell the stories of what's happening on the ground, to syndicate with these partners. So we run Global Press News Services, where we're able to not just share stories that we're covering, but also, the photojournalism, the access to stories that you just wouldn't find anywhere else. And so this partnership element is really critical to for the longevity and sustainability of local news organizations. And it's frankly, it's a real opportunity for global organizations to partner right now.
Great. Thank you to both of you for that. Another question related to this has to do with cooperation. You talked a little bit about this, Teresa. I'm wondering if you have further examples or any of the other panelists have examples. But are we seeing any evidence in this kind of economic environment of cooperation between local news outlets and community news outlets, or between different types of media where they can band together and cooperate as a way of improving coverage and cutting costs? Have you seen any examples of this in areas where you work? This is to all the panelists.
And I think, Teresa, it might be interesting if you could share kind of what Democracy Fund has been doing in terms of the local, the ecosystem news, where you're not just, shoring up the media groups themselves.
Sure, that's great. So what Sam is referring to is in several states in the US, we have basically funded entire ecosystems in order to create this collaborative mindset. So we went into, for example, Colorado, set up a new institution that is helping coordinate collaborations. There's a current COVID collaboration going between, I think, 50 news outlets. And they are running it. They are getting people money to do it. And then they are also setting up different resources like when we can be together, a co-working space, resources for training and other things like that. And we've set up these collaborative ways of working in many places. Another great example that I've learned a lot from that we've brought into others is in Alaska, there's an outlet called Coast Alaska, which basically provides HR, funding resources and back-end accounting to all of the public radio stations in the entire state. So we're working to replicate that model in many other places. And we've really seen that that is important. It is important to say that collaboration isn't easy, but it will make things better eventually, and the content will be richer. And another important point for all these efforts that we funded is equitable collaboration. So in the US, national local parachuting happens often where they come in and say, hey, you know the community, give me your stuff, and then they leave. So we think it's really important to forefront those local voices, make sure they're getting the resources, not necessarily the national outlets are getting it, and then taking things away. So what can we build that will then grow?
Great, thank you, Teresa. It's a really important point. Another set of questions focuses on crackdowns on freedom of expression that typically arise during a crisis. So one question from the audience, how are local news providers in the countries where you are working adapting to reactionary measures and increasing restrictions and attacks? And then a second related question, how can crackdowns on local journalists be amplified and protected by national and international networks? That's the question to all the panelists.
Well, I think just to start on that, I think one of the things that I've seen we had to do during the COVID-19, the fact that almost 90% of our journalists had were struggling to get clearance and so that they can work and they can move around during the lockdown and that sort of things. And one of the things that we strived to do was to make sure that the team, when they were reporting, we introduced a new platform on Facebook Live where everything that they were doing was being streamed live. In this scenario, we had one incident where one of our colleagues was about to be arrested on Facebook Live, and usually it has 10, 15 people, but as soon as that happened and everyone else were able to join in, it became a big story, and we had 1,000 people showing up immediately, and we were able to avoid an arrest. So there's it's the normal tactics, I think, on how to deal with regimes, and we have that experience, obviously. And we just superimpose that to the reporting right now, that make sure that people know where you are when you're reporting in the community, so that in case anything happens, help can be able to arrive faster, as opposed to when we don't know where you are and what you're doing. I sort of like the second question because it's leading that there should be an international way and a mechanism on how to recognize local reporters, because it's important. And like Lakshmi said, that right now the entire world entirely is waiting on local reporting. It's feeding on local reporting. It has to contend with the local reporting as opposed to international reporting because it's been grounded. So I think there should be a conversation, and it would be a good point to sort of start a conversation on how we can get local reporters to get recognition, from an international body that would hold so much water and force the hand, of these local councils who are obviously controlled by the governments, to start, recognizing journalists, local and especially local journalists in their communities.
I would just add to James's point that, the first point about check-ins, whether they're on Facebook Live or not, the importance of a check-in to a reporter, a local reporter who, needs to know that they have the backing and support of an organization that are going to have their back if anything were to happen. And frankly, it's assessing risk constantly from pitch all the way to the reporting process, making sure that we know where reporters are going, that we're deciding and determining together a strategy, a plan, understanding hyper-local details such as, what are our checkpoints along the way, details about how much fuel is in the car, details about how much credit is on your phone, all of those kinds of details allow reporters to really feel trust between the organizations they work for and the stories that they're covering. And that trust, I think, leads to a greater result in the story, frankly.
Great, thank you very much. Probably just have time for one other sort of set of questions, which is around the spread of misinformation and rumors during a crisis. So one question has to do with how we deal with situations when information about the crisis that is shared on local news outlets contradicts official information or is incorrect. And then a related question is how local reporters in your context are dealing with misinformation, if you have any examples to share for all panelists.
I would say here, even before we get to misinformation, I would say that lack of information is one of the greatest challenges we deal with. I mentioned invisible censorship earlier, and what we've been seeing is, governments responding to the current coronavirus crisis has been really erratic. You've seen, lockdown notifications coming out in capital cities, but the information isn't getting to other parts of the country until much later, where citizens don't have enough time to gather what they need for that lockdown. In other places like Sri Lanka, you'll see notifications are sent out in English and in Sinhala. Getting those notes translated to reporters in Jaffna province, for example, or just citizens in Jaffna province where they speak Tamil, is just another form of lack of information that really does not allow for people to prepare in times of crisis. So misinformation is critical, but we need to start with just getting the correct information out to communities.
Yes, James. Maybe James and Teresa, we can have some concluding remarks so that we can finish up in our promised 1 hour. So James, please go ahead.
All right, I think this I was going to add on Lakshmi's point that look, there's a value on the breaking news and moving story that obviously is bread and butter of journalism. However, what I suppose and what I think makes sense a lot with what community journalists do, if you look at the output, would be more the contextual sort of reporting, giving context to what's happening in community and nationally. And so I would worry more about how do we increase more information in communities, how do we increase the sort of content they receive in what platform and how, that sort of thing, before I worry next about the misinformation, because the misinformation really in our pattern is it comes from the top down, literally it's easy for communities to sort of break myths that are within. And they usually don't start with community journalists. However, I'd like to say that as my closing remarks that journalism is really a service, and the community journalists exemplify that service. We should figure out ways on how to make it part and parcel of our governance and our systems across the world. That this is as journalism rediscovers itself, this is going to be an important, solid sort of function and pillar of our journalism sort of comes back as a rebirth into the new world, in however form and however format it takes.
Teresa, do you have anything to add?
One, thank you. And I'll just plus one and say that we know the health of our democracy is contingent on the health of local journalism. And while there's a lot of bad things happening and crises happening, this is a great opportunity to imagine what could be. How we can fulfill those opportunities Lakshmi and James talked about. So let's take that opportunity together.
Thank you. And Lakshmi, any closing remarks?
Just thank you for hosting this really important conversation during this moment that we're in. And, I just want to reiterate that COVID-19 is really showing us that local stories are global stories, and there is a lot to learn from places around the world navigating this crisis, and that how local communities are responding and the stories that local reporters are sharing are of the utmost importance right now.
Well, this has been an excellent discussion. It's a really big topic for a 1 hour discussion, but I think we just wanted to provide some space for people to come together to, begin to tease out some of the key issues at the heart of the problem. And, the interesting points that were brought up regarding kind of the challenges with the revenue models, with the livelihood of reporters, with the holistic well-being of reporters that have been kind of particularly, the needs have been particularly acute, political pressures, the COVID pandemic coverage. I think the collaboration that was outlined by all of the panelists, James was talking about the need for collaboration between local news groups and also local news groups with national groups. Teresa's point about coordination between the donors in terms of what we're requiring for, when we're working with local news groups, and also Lakshmi's point about collaboration between the local reporters and foreign correspondents are very interesting. Point taken about the importance of unrestricted funding to help local news organizations kind of remain nimble. I think, and as well, because I think all of the panelists also highlighted the importance of kind of the demand-driven approach to supporting local news and providing support that can, that allows the local news organizations to, prioritize the specific issues and priorities that are most relevant to their communities. I think all of these points give us a lot to chew on and will serve as the basis for future conversations that will hopefully kickstart some action. So a big thanks to James, Teresa, and Lakshmi for sharing your insights with us today. And thank you to the audience as well for participating. And we will see you at the next CIMA event.